All right, let's get going. So today, I'm going to be talking about the interplay between climate change and biogeography. So I know a lot of you, being majors in the geography department, probably have had some background on learning about how climate change has been occurring over the past and maybe some of the evidences that we have to document how we know that it's actually occurring. But what you likely have not been exposed to is the interplay that this ongoing change has had with biodiversity patterns across the planet. So today what we're going to do is kind of slightly different than some of the previous lectures. We're going to go through and talk about some major concepts documenting how climate change affects biogeography. But as opposed to past, where most of my lectures are very concept-based and I give maybe a few examples to follow up and help you understand how these concepts actually apply, this lecture is going to be incredibly example-based. So for studying, I'm still not going to ask you about explicit details like things like species names or those sorts of things, but I might ask you on an exam about some of the exact examples that I'm giving. So I want you to understand or know what the examples are and be able to identify the basic patterns that they're representing in each of the cases that I'm presenting today. So let's go forward and talk a bit about this interplay between biogeography and climate change. But just as a primer, just so you know, if you didn't already know, climate's been changing over the last 100 years or so. And especially over the last 30 years of climatic record, we have ample evidence to suggest that climate's been shifting at a rate at which greatly exceeds that with the rate of change at which it's occurred over the recent to distant past. For instance, 18 of the last 19 summers have been the hottest ever recorded on human history. And there was this incredible report that was put together by the IPCC in 2014, which documented that between 1983 and 2013, we've experienced some of the warmest years ever to occur within the last 1,400 years time period. And that's been evidenced both through geologic evidence, through global climatic sensors measuring air temperature, and also by documenting things like changes in the temperatures of upper sea levels throughout the planet. All of this has resulted in lots of massive climatic shifts and changes in the environment around the world, where we see things like sea levels slowly rising across the planet, where we've been able to measure that current sea levels since 1950 are higher than they've been since the last 2,000 years of history on the Earth. In addition to that, we've seen changes in things like snow cover. And all of this also, we have strong evidence to suggest that all of this has been driven by man-made processes, whereby there's been this greater influx and production of things like carbon dioxide through the burning of greenhouse gases that we've been able to identify has risen or driven up CO2 concentrations to be at levels greater than they have been during the last 800,000 years across the planet. Now, how do we know that? We know that through these sea ice or sea ice core data sets that we've mentioned in previous lectures, where we can drill into ice layers and actually look at the bubbles of air that get accumulated as those water layers have been laid down over the past and actually examine the level of CO2 that concentration that's present in each of those layers. And we can compare the level of CO2 that's existed in the past versus that which we see today, and we see that it greatly exceeds the ratio of CO2 in the atmosphere that we've seen relative to the past. Actually, each one of those colors that you see in the diagrams here actually represents a different sampling location of data, whereby information has been gathered about CO2 levels across the planet. So we have ample evidence to suggest that not only is climate changing, but it's also been affected by, this has been largely driven by human processes or human activities across the planet. Now, the question that we then have drawing away from this as biogeographers is try to identify how these massive shifts in temperature change have influenced biogeographic patterns. Well, when we think about biogeographic changes, when scientists were first identifying that there seemed to be this shift in climate, they surmised that this would likely have an effect on the living world around us. But a lot of them estimated that it would probably take several decades before we see any major sort of evidences of these climatic shifts over the planets, because species have some sort of innate tolerances that they've likely adapted to be able to tolerate some level of climatic shift no matter what environment that they've been in. And we were incredibly surprised to find out that within just 10 years after our first data sets were coming in, identifying that climate change was coming around, in periods even as early as the early 1990s, we were starting to identify that species were already responding to these global climatic shifts. For instance, there was this amazing study that was review that was written in early 2003 that identified that species have been shifting overall. And one ways that we can identify how species have been shifting is to think about how we know that species have shifted in the past. Now, you recall from our lecture on climatic responses to past Earth history processes that species have three basic sort of avenues of responses that they can take when you have huge scale sort of climatic shifts across the planet. On one end, they can either, if your local habitat shifts, you can either adapt to the new environment as it slowly evolves or it slowly changes. If you have certain standing variants within your population, although a lot of your species that occur alongside you, a lot of other individuals may die, those individuals that have those highly adapted traits are able to survive in those new environments and pass on those traits to subsequent generations. And thus those species are able to adapt to their new environment. If you're not able to adapt to this new environment as it slowly emerges around you, you also have another option, which is to move to follow an optimal habitat, to try to identify a new area where you could potentially move to, where the habitat is still suitable in the area around you, and you can continue to reproduce and survive, even though the area where you previously occurred might not be optimal or within your niched range of tolerance for survival. Well, if you're unable to follow either of these two pathways, then your only choice, or not really a choice really, your only option is to die or locally or go globally extinct in response to these changes. So again, as I was saying before, I kind of got off track a little bit here in my ordering. But as I was saying, scientists thought that it would take a long time for species to be pushed into one of these different pathways as we documented global climatic shifts. And there was this amazing review that was done in 2003 looking at this whole suite of different papers that have been conducted to try to identify species responses to climatic changes. And what they looked at was something like almost nearly 1,600 different studies. And of those, almost half of them identified, 41% of them, identified that species are already undergoing significant levels of change or responding in some way, following one of these avenues in response to global climatic change patterns. So what sort of global, we're going to do today in this lecture is walk through some of these examples of some of the most significant levels of changes that we have observed. But what sort of global trends did they observe along each of these, of species responding along each of these pathways? Well, in general, trying to document evolutionary change over time is a little bit difficult because, especially when we look at morphological patterns, we're never quite sure if maybe a shift in a trait that's being displayed or a behavioral pattern might be shifting over time, whether that's due to an actual evolutionary response or if it's due to maybe something like what we call phenotypic plasticity, where by a different area of the genome being expressed because of some sort of different environmental cue in a given area. Nevertheless, people have been able to identify that there's been phenotypic or morphological shifts or behavioral shifts over time. And what that at least shows us is that there's been some sort of response, at least in the outward traits, that species are showing in certain environments. For instance, one of the most distinct patterns that people have been able to identify are shifts in phenological patterns or phenological behaviors or traits that get displayed that are responses to seasonal fluctuations within their environment. So what we've seen overall, looking across studies, is that there's been crazy shifts in the timing at which behaviors or traits are being displayed throughout the season, which have led to something like a 2.3-day shift in timing per decade over the last 30 to 50 years. So species over the whole do seem to be responding, seem to be shifting their overall trends to match climatic changes across the planet. So that gives us some indication that species may be adapting as local climates shift. In addition, they may be changing their overall movement or their overall distribution to try to follow optimal habitat as it overall shifts. In general, we've seen that there's been this, within the northern hemisphere, there's been this major movement pattern whereby species have begun either moving further and further north or further and further up elevation along their boundaries, whereby there's been around about a 6.1 kilometer northward shift that's occurred every single decade that we've been observing over the last 50 years or so, which has also been associated with around a 6.1 meter upward migration, up elevation, as climates have slowly shifted across these distributional ranges. Well, what else have we identified? If you're not able to evolve or move, what's your last option? Well, you might be pushed to local extinction if you're unable to tolerate these new environments as they have occurred. And in fact, we've seen some evidence that extinction actually has been ongoing in response to global climate change. And people have tried to develop different models to project how that extinction rate is likely to progress into the future. And one of the ways in which they've been doing that is by looking at this major variable that we've just identified in our island biogeography lecture, that is a major variable to determine local species diversity or species richness patterns. And that's the area of available habitat. And so people have created these models where they've tried to estimate what proportion of species do we expect to be lost into the future as climates continue to shift and habitat becomes less and less available to different sorts of species. And they've predicted that we expect going into 2050 that there should be likely going to be somewhere between a 15 to 37% loss in species diversity or species richness across the planet in response to all of these climatic shifts that are undergoing. So let's try to break these down throughout these lectures to talk about specific examples of how these changes are occurring to either lead to local adaptation, to lead to migration, or to lead to local extinction. And what evidence do we have to demonstrate that each of these pathways is undergoing? So let's start with that first one, with some evidence of local adaptation through phenological shifts. Now again, just as a reminder of what phenology actually is, phenology is the study of periodic plant and animal life cycle events and trying to understand how these are influenced by seasonal or interannual variation in climate throughout a species given range. So what are these sort of cues that time out or initiate these different behavioral or morphological or life cycle events within species? Well, you have different sort of climatic or environmental cues that begin or initiate these behaviors. Things like day length, which we've talked about in our Earth history lecture, shifts throughout the year, especially away from the equator. Towards the poles, we have massive fluctuations in the length of the day throughout the year, and this can initiate different behaviors where certain species are able to identify that perhaps the day is longer or the day is shorter during a certain period of year, and that they're going to change what their behavior, or maybe certain gene regions might get expressed at a higher frequency when there's greater or lesser overall light throughout the day. Other sorts of cues are things like seasonal temperature, which might be higher or lowered throughout the year, or water availability, which is going to be influenced by rainfall seasonality throughout the year. So each of these types of cues can cue up different sorts of morphological or behavioral responses. Well, what sort of examples do we have of what those responses might be, these phenological behaviors? Well, we have things that influence growing periods like bud burst, like the period of time in which plants first start to produce their photosynthetic growing material throughout the year, where they form their first flowers during the spring of a given year, which are both going to be cued up by different environmental or climatic forces that are going to indicate to them that resources are now available, and so they can focus on producing new photosynthetic activity because there's going to be an increase in availability of both water and sunlight within their environment. In animals, we have temperature or climate or environmental cues that are going to signal things like courtship display or egg laying or even emergence from the eggs after there's been a certain significant period of time. Within plants, you also have signals from the climate that's going to tell you when to stop your photosynthetic activity because resources are going to become less available. So this is where we have, like within New England, you have these fall leaf colors that start to emerge as leaves start to senesce and fall off from the tree, so that the tree is investing less overall energy in photosynthetic activity. You have cues within animals for migration to try to move out of areas where resources are no longer going to be available. And for within some animals, maybe they're not going to move, maybe they'll stay within a given area, but hibernate throughout these periods of drought when there's going to be less overall resource availability during certain portions of the year. So each of these are examples of phenological behaviors, these things that are cued by local environmental or climatic cues that could potentially shift as local climate shifts throughout each of these different areas. So what sort of examples do we have of shifts that have been ongoing? When we think about being able to detect climate change responses to of different animals, the sort of things that we're going to need are long-term studies to be able to have some sort of baseline on which to compare current trends in phenological behaviors to what they look like at certain periods in the past. And so that's incredibly difficult because obviously we haven't over the periods of time in which climate change has been occurring, hundreds of years, we haven't been recording necessarily long-term data sets that would be reliable on which we could base our analyses. However, what many scientists have recently been doing is trying to delve into different records that people like agricultural agents, government agents, or maybe personal journals of things like farmers have recorded over time to try to track phenological responses of different plants or animals that might have been important for their overall jobs. So actually what we've been able to amass recently are some of these long-term data sets that actually allows us to look at phenological changes over not just the course of maybe 20 to 40 to 100 years, but over several hundred years actually throughout certain areas. For instance, one of the best data sets that we have is actually within Kyoto, Japan, where scientists have amassed a 600-year data set of flowering timing of the cherry blossoms within Japan, which have been collected from either personal journals or governmental records within those areas. And from those records, we've been able to document how the timing of cherry blossom emergence has shifted over the last 600 years. And when we look at it, in fact, we do see that there's been a significant shift within the last 100 years, where there was a generally stable timing at which cherry blossom emergence occurred for the 500 years preceding the early 1900s, but just within the last 100 to 150 years, just following the Industrial Revolution, there's been a significant shift to earlier and earlier flowering time of cherry blossoms within this environment, giving us a strong indication of a phenological response within a plant species within this environment. So there we have this significant level of evidence that species do respond, at least in their outward display, overall in response to climatic shifts. Well, what other sorts of levels of evidence would we need to have in order to have more of a conclusive evidence that species are responding to climatic shifts? Well, we'd want something more than just a single site location like we have here. We'd likely want to have some sort of evidence of studies that have been occurred not only over long-term periods of time, but also have been collected over a widespread geographic area. So we wouldn't know for certain if we documented a species response to climatic shifts that it wasn't due to maybe some sort of local confounding effect, that this was a widespread species response. Well, one of the tricks that we have in conducting widespread investigations is that you might have the influence not only of climatic shifts, but you might have also local adaptive forces driving divergence or driving differences in phenological responses. Well, one of the great things that people have been able to do, scientists in Europe have been able to do in the past to try to reduce confounding influence of genetic difference on tracking phenological responses within plant species, is to take advantage of this interesting pattern of sexual reproduction that certain trees or shrubs have in their reproductive pattern. And this is the ability to reproduce asexually or clonally, whereby some plant species are able to put out either roots or shoots off of their main plant structure that grow outside of the major plant and produce a new individual that's a genetic duplicate of the initial maternal plant species. And those individuals that move off from the initial maternal plant can eventually break away from the mom and become independently viable. Well, what scientists have done is taken advantage of that reproductive pattern that these these tree species have and taken identical clones of one single plant from a single location and planted them at multiple different locations throughout Europe and tracked the response of all these genetically identical individuals across a broad geographic area. And so this has led to the establishment of these areas known as the European climatological gardens. These areas of these arboretums, basically, that are housed in different areas throughout Europe, where people, since the early 1960s, have been tracking phenological behaviors across a huge suite of different tree and shrub species throughout Europe. And what have they been able to record? Well, they've recorded massive shifts in phenological behaviors across these genetically identical individuals across multiple different species, whereby we've seen an increasing trend of earlier and earlier bud burst or emergence of photosynthetic activity throughout this time period, and a later and later senescing period on which leaves are lost in the fall periods of each year. What this results in is just a significant increase in the overall growing period throughout the entirety of Europe, seen both on the southern and northern fringe of the distribution of this area that seems to be linked to the climatic shift throughout this environment. So again, over a broad geographic scale across several different species, we see this common trend of increasing growing period that's coincided with this increase in temperature in response to climate shifts across this range. Well, again, here we were trying to look at widespread areas. One of the best widespread studies that we have of documenting massive amounts of changes across several different plant species has actually been observed within the Arctic, whereby there's been this documented shift in growing patterns throughout northern habitats within both shrub and tundra species in those areas, whereby as early as 1980, 1990, people identified that there was this increase in photosynthetic activity in northern habitats that seemed to be responding to global climate change in those areas, whereby new habitats were becoming more available for new establishment, or new nutrients were becoming more and more available for individual species to grow at a greater rate than they had at the past. And in the 90s, we didn't know if this was a fluke or this was signified some sort of greater change or greater trend towards higher overall growing rates throughout this environment. But every single subsequent decade since the 1990s, different studies have come out showing that this trend has done nothing but continue, both through the 90s and the 2000s, as growing within northern habitats has continued to increase as climate shift has continued to rise within those habitats. And this is in response to these changes where you've had longer and longer growing periods because you have warmer and warmer temperatures, opening up the period of time throughout the year in which species have in which to grow within each of these environments. Well, there we have three solid levels of evidence from plants on both long periods of time and across broad geographic areas that seem to demonstrate that there's been phenological shifts that have responded to climate change. In addition, within animals, we have several different studies that have documented similar patterns of phenological shifts in response to climate change. For instance, there was this great study that was conducted in New York looking at the mating behavior of frog species in and around Ithaca, New York, whereby they looked at old data that had been collected in the early 1900s, timing the date at which frogs first initiated their calling in order to initiate reproduction with their mates. And what they identified was that there's been this significant shift whereby the timing of the calling behavior of these frogs in these habitats has slowly shifted to be 12 days earlier than the dates at which it was observed 100 years ago in the early 1900s. So over 100 years, we've seen a 12-day shift in the calling behavior of frogs within this environment. Now, this isn't limited, again, to just local-scale studies. We have broad-scale studies across multiple taxa that seem to identify similar trends across other animal species. For instance, within the UK, there's been several studies that have tried to look across multiple different songbird species to identify the dates on which they first lay their eggs throughout the UK. And what we've identified across a study of something like 20 different bird species, examining something on the order of 74,000 different nests across the UK, we find across all species that were studied that there's been a general shift towards earlier and earlier egg laying that's occurred since the 1970s until today. In addition, there was a great study that was conducted documenting shifts in emergence patterns of butterflies, also within the UK, documenting that emergence time of butterflies has also shifted to become earlier and earlier. Something like 26 of the 35 different species of butterflies that were examined within the study between 1970s and the 2000s have shifted to have earlier emergence times than they had previous during the early 1970 period in which the study was first begun. So across both plants and animals, we see these strong evidences that species seem to be shifting their overall phenological patterns, giving some indication of adaptation, or at least shifting their overall displays or morphological displays that we're seeing in these different environments. Now we might ask ourselves, this seems to be interesting, but why does it actually matter in the long term for species in these environments? Well, we have to think about the fact that the interplay amongst these phenological patterns is really important to determine a species' overall chance of survival. And the trick is that not all species are going to be able to shift equally in their overall phenological response as the timing of these events begin to progress. For instance, think about that study that we talked about at the beginning of this course. That study that was conducted by my friend Chuck Davis on Walden Pond, where he was looking at this long-term data set that was collected by Henry David Thoreau. Within that environment, looking at flowering times and abundance shifts within both multiple different plant species in that environment. And what he identified was that those species that seem to be invading into that environment have this general trend where they're predominantly those species that are better able to track climatic shifts, and those species that have been declining, those native species in those environments, are the ones that are unable to shift their overall phenological patterns to track shifts in climatic change. So what this means is that although some species might be able to shift their phenological behaviors to track climate change and continue to survive as it progresses in some environments, that's going to give them a significant advantage over other species in those environments that are unable to track those changes and are less able to survive as climate continues to change. In addition to this competition that's going on amongst species and ability to track climatic shifts, we also know that these shifts, you have different species that are going to respond differently and may be interdependent on each other to determine their local survival. And because we have this fact that we have these different types of cues that are initiating these phenological behaviors or these phenological traits in these species, some of these cues are drastically shifting as climate change progresses, like maybe temperature seasonality or rainfall seasonality, such that maybe certain species are going to be emerging or displaying their behavior at different times as those shifts occur. But if you have other species who are initiated by those climatic patterns that aren't going to be changing with climate change, things like day length, which is not affected by climate change, it's going to just stay the same, that means that these behaviors of different species that currently occur alongside each other and might be dependent on each other for survival might become decoupled as these climate change patterns progress. For instance, we've talked about numerous different mutualistic behaviors, things like flowering times of plants, flowering plants which are dependent on availability of pollinators in order to survive, and pollinators are dependent on flowers in order to survive in certain environments. If the timing of the emergence of the pollinator and the flowering time of the plant get decoupled, what we're going to find is that the dispersal agent for the plant to reproduce is not going to be available, not allowing them to reproduce in a given environment. And the major resource on which the pollinator is dependent in order to survive in a given environment is also not going to be present. So we could potentially see two different species being driven locally extinct in response to this decoupling of different phenological displays. Even antagonistic relationships, where we have these predator-prey interactions that we don't necessarily think as being net positive, we've talked about throughout this lecture, may actually allow for greater overall long-term viability of a given species because of these food web interactions, whereby maybe you have predator predator populations that keep multiple species levels through top-down control at low overall levels so that you don't have one species rising above another species, outcompeting another. Or we might have competitive interactions that are also interdependent within these environments to try to maintain relatively low population numbers amongst groups that allows for a greater overall diversity of species or species richness within a given area due to the interaction of different species. And again, if we have this mistiming that's going on, these interactions might be discoupled so that they're not possible to actually occur within a given environment, potentially decreasing overall the diversity or species richness within a given environment. So what sort of examples do we have of these decouplings actually occurring? Do we actually see this actually occurring within the wild? Well, in fact, we actually do. We have several different examples of these different sort of behavioral types that have become decoupled or disrupted through climatic shifts. One of the most stark examples we have is within the Rocky Mountains, where we have these marmot species in these environments. Marmots are just another word for groundhogs, what we call groundhogs within mountain environments. And marmots go through this hibernation behavior whereby they'll go dormant during the winter and they'll go through sleeping patterns like we normally associate with things like bears. And what cues marmot emergence is the overall temperature of the surrounding ambient air within those areas. And what we've seen over the last 70 years or so is that the emergence time of marmots within the Rocky Mountains has slowly become earlier and earlier within these environments. Now, the trick is that when these marmots are emerging from their environment, they're incredibly dependent on finding enough nutrients on which to gain back all of these fat stores that they've lost over the winter in order to be able to guarantee that they're going to survive into the upcoming summer. And the trick is that the major food source for these marmots in these environments is generally local plant or forb populations. And because of these crazy nuances that we see within climatic patterns, although temperatures slowly increase throughout the Rocky Mountains, what we've seen is also an associated increase in snowfall throughout these environments, so that the melting time of the overlying snow throughout these environments has led to a later and later overall emergence of flowers and plants within this area. So although the marmots are emerging much earlier each year, what we see is that their food resource is emerging much later as climate change is affected. And we've seen decrease in overall weights of early emerging marmots in response to this, and overall declines in certain populations in response to a decrease in resource availability as these climatic shifts have advanced throughout this area. Well, do we have any other examples? We have another example of another antagonistic relationship that has occurred in response to climatic shifts around the planet. And that is a pretty interesting example of a parasite and host interaction, whereby there's this certain species of parasitic wasp known as Cotesia that parasitizes this incredibly common species of butterfly known as the Granville fritillary. And what we see is that the fritillary goes through this period of time before it eventually becomes a butterfly where it lives its life as a caterpillar, like we normally associate most butterfly species of going through these different life stages. And as the caterpillar starts to grow, it goes through these stages known as instars, where they start to feed on leaf material in their surrounding environment, and they grow and grow and grow until they basically outgrow their exterior skin and go through this molting period in which they transition from a smaller caterpillar to a larger one. Now, they're incredibly susceptible to attack during this period of time in which they're going through this molting, because they're basically set on staying in one location for anywhere up to a 24-hour or even longer period of time as they slowly molt off their outer coat. Well, this has been an advantage for this parasitic wasp, because what it does is it goes in and around these areas where the caterpillar is going through this molting process, and what it will do is lay its eggs alongside the caterpillar. And what this does is guarantee that as the eggs of the wasp begin to emerge, it's going to have a food source on which they can initially feed upon as the eggs burst away from these eggs, or as the larvae burst from these eggs in that given environment. Now the trick is that the ability of either the wasp to be able to parasitize on the caterpillar, or the caterpillar to evade the wasp, is incredibly dependent on overall temperature within a given environment. Because what we see is that we have both size and color difference of the eggs of the wasp and the exterior of the caterpillar. So that in general, if you have a sunny but cold environment, what we find is that because the caterpillar is slightly larger, it's able to retain a larger amount of its interior body heat, and also allow itself to heat at a much faster rate than the white eggs of the parasitic wasp. And so if you have a cooler environment that is sunny, generally, what we find is there's a greater likelihood that a caterpillar is going to evade being eaten by these parasitic wasps. However, as temperatures have slowly risen in many of the environments where these species co-occur, what we've seen is that there's been a ramping up in the ability of the wasps to emerge at a much faster rate, giving them a greater likelihood that they're going to emerge and be able to feast upon the caterpillar before it moves away, having shed its skin. So in fact, what we see is that there's been this increase in the timing, or decrease in the amount of days that's required for the parasitic wasp to emerge, which has led to a greater and greater fraction of the larvae of these butterflies being eaten each subsequent generation, overall leading to a decline in Granville fritillary populations throughout this range, due to this shift in phenological displays within the different behaviors of these two different species. All right. One last example, also within a butterfly, we see within the Edith's checker spot butterfly, which has kind of a similar sort of response that we saw within our marmot species. This Edith's checker spot butterfly is a species of butterfly that occurs within California and much of the western seaboard. And the way in which it is able to evade competition with other species that are similar to it, to try to capture up all of the resources of food within the flowering populations in its area, is to emerge at the earliest period of the growing period of the season, to be the first one to emerge, to guarantee that it's going to be the first one to arrive on early emerging flowers and collect all of the available nectar resources that are being produced. Now the trick is, because it's such an early emerging species, what we've seen is that it gets queued up by things like temperature that have slowly risen throughout this environment. However, like we saw within the Rocky Mountains, due to increased snowfall in some of the environments throughout California, what we've also seen is a subsequent later and later emergence time of many flowering plant species within this environment. And so what this has led to, so we have warmer years have led to earlier overall butterfly emergence, but later flowering period, which leads to butterflies emerging in certain habitats where they have no resources on which to survive, leading to an overall retraction or local extinctions of the pollinators throughout certain areas of its environment, whereby there are certain areas where it used to be incredibly abundant that observe drastic reductions in overall populations of the checker spot butterfly within these different environments in response to these climatic shifts, decreasing its overall available resources as it first emerges following its dormancy through the winter. All right, so that takes us through lots of examples of phenological shifts within these environments. What sort of examples do we have of range shifts, or examples of movement, species moving to try to follow habitat as it becomes less hospitable in their local environment, to try to move to areas where it maintains factors within its climatic niche? Well, we've seen across numerous species, across several different taxa, there's been this global trend, as we said at the top of this lecture, towards moving towards the poles, whereby there's habitat that's become more available towards the poles, where species have moved towards those areas as become warmer. And there's been a decrease in populations at or near the equator as though they become less hospitable for species survival as climate has shifted across, and this has been observed across taxa. What specific examples do we have of these sorts of patterns? Not only affecting just a few, but multiple species, or just species assemblies. Well, we see certain drastic patterns, again, towards the poles, which have been affected at the greatest rate overall as climate change has progressed. For instance, in Antarctica, we have these species of sea ice, or of ice algae that grow on sea ice within those environments, especially within these areas where you have these ices that form off the coast of Antarctica, whereby they can establish either on the bottom layer of the ice, which are still low enough to allow sunlight to penetrate through and allow photosynthesis to continue, or they potentially establish themselves between the cracks in different ice masses in these areas. Well, as in certain environments within Antarctica, you've seen this increase in overall melting of Antarctic sea ice, you've also seen this subsequent decline in ice algae populations that have steadily decreased over the last 30 years or so. What this has led to is basically a cascade and decline in multiple different populations of species that are subsequently dependent on the ice algae through bottom-up interactions in order to guarantee their overall survival, because ice algae are actually the major food source for different krill populations, these small little shrimp-like species, within this environment. And over the last 30 years or so, we've seen it somewhere between, in some environments, anywhere between a 38 to 75% reduction in krill abundance off the coast of Antarctica in response to this decline in ice algae abundance. Now, as you have declines in overall krill abundance, you have less food resources for those species that are dependent on them. Things like our offshore seabirds or local fish populations that primarily feed on these krill populations and are dependent on the abundance of krill in order to survive. Well, as you've had declines in things like fish, you've also seen subsequent declines in things like offshore marine mammals or local penguin populations in certain areas of Antarctica. And in fact, if we look at some of these areas that have been most impacted by these declines in ice algae, we see through this loss of ice algae, there's been incredible losses at these higher trophic levels of things like penguins, whereby in certain areas in the past we've seen upwards of over 300 different breeding pairs in a certain environment, and today only find less than 9 different pairs of breeding pairs of penguins due to this bottom-up interaction that's limited the number of individuals that can potentially establish due to a limited amount of overall food resource. So as we've seen this shift in distribution of these ice algae that slowly retracted as their habitats become less available, we see subsequent retraction of distributions of all of these other species that are also associated with them through these trophic interactions. We see a similar sort of pattern of movement, not just within the Antarctic, but we also see similar patterns in the Arctic, whereby, as we said at the top of this lecture, there's been this global change or this global response that we've seen in the Arctic of this pattern known as the greening of the Arctic, whereby you've seen an increase in overall photosynthetic activity that's occurred. And what's also been associated with that is this pattern known as the expansion of shrubs throughout the Arctic, whereby shrub populations have slowly been expanding outwards, expanding their overall ranges through the Arctic as climate change has progressed. Now, one of the reasons that we think that this is advancing in this area is a shift in reproductive patterns of shrubs within these environments, whereby most shrubs, oftentimes in cold environments, are predominantly asexual in their reproduction. Remember we talked about before how there's certain species of plants that can reproduce asexually, whereby they put off these vegetative structures off the mother plant and are able to essentially create identical clones of the mother through just vegetative means. Now, this is incredibly useful or beneficial means of reproduction in cold environments for many shrub populations because you have this very limited growing season on which you could allow for something like a seed to initially move out away from a parent and establish itself and grow enough vegetative structure in order to survive the subsequent winter. But what some scientists believe is actually going on is leading to this expansion of shrubs within these environments is that as you've had warming within these areas, you've had an increased period of time in which you could have seed establishment and dispersal within these areas, and an increased time in which seeds could potentially establish themselves and guarantee that they could potentially survive the upcoming winter. And what this was allowed for is a much faster rate of overall expansion compared to just sheer clonal reproduction, which can only move short distances in and away from the mother, whereas a seed can be dispersed by things like wind over incredibly large geographic distances, which would help explain why shrub expansion is occurring over such long distances overall in these environments. All right, well, here we have two examples of shifts in overall distributional patterns that have occurred in response to climate at both poles. We also have examples within temperate regions. Oh, wait. Before we go there, let's talk about one other Arctic example. I think I'm actually contractually obligated, if I give a lecture on climate change, to show a picture of a polar bear on a floating piece of ice. And in fact, polar bears are a great example of the impact of climate change on the viability of animal populations, because as you've had the reduction in cover of sea ice within areas like the Hudson Bay, you've seen that there's a reduction in the overall areas on which polar bears can collect their primary prey within these environments. And this has led not only to a reduction in the overall number of offspring that are produced on average by polar bears in these environments, we've also identified within individuals within these populations that there's an overall reduction in body mass within average population size that's occurred over the last 20 to 30 years in these areas as their habitats have become more marginalized and their primary prey, things like our ringed seals in these environments, have become less available for them to feed upon, and they've become more marginalized overall. All right, now we have three examples at the poles. Let's move into a temperate example of how species respond in each of these different, in a new type of environment. Well, we have several different both local and broad-scale sort of examples of species within temperate region showing dramatic shifts in their overall distributional patterns. For instance, in certain areas we see, within the UK, we see studies looking across multiple different species of dragonflies or insect populations that show across multiple species. For instance, in this one we saw 23 of 24 species showing a northward shift in their overall range. We're seeing similar patterns within multiple different butterfly species throughout Europe that seem to be moving further and further north over the last 100 years. This has also been observed within multiple populations of birds throughout Europe, both within Europe and globally, that seem to be moving north. One of the coolest examples of this pattern of northward migration within temperate regions, I think, is this great study that was conducted in Europe in these two different towns within Germany, which in the past had very low abundance of overall lichen species diversity within their habitats because they're at the upper range of where most temperate lichen species generally occur. And what they've done within this town is identified this shift of increasing overall diversity of lichen species that have occurred within their town over the last 30 years. And what they've seen is that over time you see this increase in abundance of lichen diversity of these previously only southern species of lichen that have started to establish within these two different locations over time as climate has become increasingly more hospitable for their establishment within these two northern German towns in this environment. So across both animals and plants in temperate regions, we see this dramatic shift in overall distributional patterns. Within the tropics, we expect the least amount of overall change in patterns because, again, the tropics have the least amount of overall seasonality and thus should ideally be the least affected by global climatic change. But nevertheless, we still see a shift in overall distributional patterns of species in the tropics in response to these global climatic changes. For instance, we have species that exist part of their lives within the tropics and then migrate to different areas throughout the year, shifting the areas that they move to throughout their either summer or winter season in response to climatic shifts. So for instance, there are certain butterfly species that used to spend part of their summers within Spain have slowly begun to migrate further and further north into more northern habitats that are much milder throughout their summers, that they're able to better survive as climate has become less and less hospitable within areas within Spain. And for instance, within North America, we see species like certain hummingbird species that used to travel all the way south into the southern areas of Mexico for their overwintering population, to overwinter in, but have within the last 30 years, started to shift their areas in which they overwinter to more northern areas, like here on the coast of Texas, or areas like Louisiana, which are now much more hospitable to allow them to overwinter in, and requiring them to move less further south into the tropics during these colder seasons of the winter. All right. So there we have several different examples of shifts across multiple environments in species in response to climatic change. What about this last response that species have? We talked about movement. We've talked about local adaptation. What evidence do we have to identify that extinctions have been ongoing in response to climatic changes? Well, the issue with identifying extinction within species is it's generally kind of difficult because you have to not only know what species occur across the planet, which we don't have a total record of how many species actually exist, but you also have to have long-term records to actually identify that they've gone either locally or globally extinct, which is not obviously easy within certain areas. But however, we've already talked about certain patterns within each of these subsequent sections which are likely to be driving extinctions both locally and globally as they progress. For instance, as we have the expansion of some species moving into new environments, that's always going to be likely pushing other species out of those areas as these new species move in and occupy previously potentially occupied niches within each of these environments. Also, we have all of these decouplings which are going on, which are going to lead to either local or global extinctions as species become decoupled within each of these different environments. And this can both be, occur on multiple different levels depending on how they progress within certain areas. Now, in spite of the fact that this is so difficult to document extinction events, we nevertheless have several different distinct examples of different species group responding both negatively and leading to local large-scale extinctions within certain taxa across the planet. One of the starkest examples we see actually are within amphibians as a whole, but one of the striking examples we have is within one specific taxonomic group of amphibians, these species that occur within cloud forests in the tropics known as the harlequin toads. These harlequin toads are actually also called things like poison dart frogs because they emit these poisonous chemicals off of their skin, and these were used by indigenous populations in these regions to try to tip things like their spear tips or their dart tips in order to use for hunting in these given environments. And up until the period in time up until the 1970s, there had been something like 110 different species of harlequin toads, these incredibly colorful toad species that had been identified within the tropics. And since that period of time, there's been this huge drop-off in their overall number of species within these environments, so that we've seen something like a 67% loss in species of harlequin toads that have gone just totally extinct within these tropical environments. And here, this map actually shows you what that looks like. Here where we see the total number of species that have been previously identified at each of these sort of elevational niche habitats. And the gray bar is showing you the loss of species within each of those different areas. This loss of species baffled scientists for a while, but then they identified that what has happened as climate change has progressed, you've led to this shift of increasing humidity within these cloud forest environments, which has led to an increasingly hospitable environment for this major fungus species that infects toads within these environments, the species of fungus known as amphibian chytrid fungus. And what it does is it sets into these toads and it basically eats them from the inside out. It destroys their respiratory tracts. It leads to overall weight loss. It leads to shedding of the skin, so that usually within 8 days of initially being infected by this fungus, an amphibian is guaranteed to go local, to die. And it spreads rampantly within these environments and has become prolific within these areas where you've had this increasingly humid environment that has become more conducive for its spread within these areas. Now, there's actually fear that this fungus is not just affecting this one group, these harlequin toads, but maybe affecting amphibians as a whole across the world. There's certainly seen to be estimate that this fungus seems to be attaching to somewhere around a scale of around 30% of global amphibian populations around the world. Now, we haven't seen as much dramatic effect as we've seen within these cloud forest environment, but there's lots of fear that as certain temperatures become more humid within different environments, it may spread out and affect more and more amphibians throughout multiple different sort of climatic areas across the globe, leading to massive numbers of losses of amphibian populations around the world. Now, in addition to these amphibians, we also see another group that's been dramatically affected by climatic shifts. And that's coral populations in these nearshore environments, especially within the tropics. Now, coral are these interesting organisms that are actually kind of similar to lichen, where they have this endosymbiotic relationship, where you have this internal organism that does most of the food production for the overall total organism, and you have this outer structure of this separate organism that creates a home on which the internal structure can actually live and gain protection. Now, this internal structure is what we call a zooanthely, and it's able to produce all of the nutrients and energy that's needed for the outer and internal structure through either photosynthetic or actually eating activity that it does within those environments. Now, the trick is that zooanthely is incredibly temperature sensitive. It's an environment. And that we see is that even a small change in local temperature can lead to massive die-offs of the local zooanthely. And the coral, the outer coral structure, gains something like 80% of its overall nutrients and energy from this internal zooanthely. So although it can survive small periods of time if the zooanthely gets killed inside of it, if you don't have a very rapid reimmigration of zooanthely back into the coral, you're likely going to have massive extirpation of coral populations within these different environments. And actually what we've seen within several different areas as you've had these climatic shifts is this process whereby the zooanthely within the coral dies off, leaving behind this outer bony structure of the coral, leading to this thing that's known as coral bleaching, whereby the zooanthely within the coral dies off, leading to the outer structure turning white because it's the zooanthely that actually gives the coral its color. And after a period of time, if the zooanthely doesn't re-immigrate back into the internal coral structure, we see that the coral will be locally dead within each of these environments. And we've actually seen that as climate change has progressed within these across the globe, there's been massive die-offs of coral populations across the world. And in addition to that, as you've had increasing frequency of things like tropical storms that increase the turbidity of these environments whereby there's less overall amount of light resource that reaches these coral populations, this has also led to a die-off of many zooanthelles in certain areas, leading to coral bleaching and coral die-off. For instance, I think it was between 97 and 98, there was this huge, massive global storms that occurred that led to increasing levels of turbidity across all of the world's oceans. But especially within the Indian Oceans, you saw this huge die-off of coral populations within that area, where it's estimated somewhere on the scale of 90% of the coral population within the Indian Oceans died within that one-year event. Now, we've seen some indication that there's been recovery since that period of time. However, ongoing change and shifts within temperature and increases in turbidity with some of these environments is likely to lead to increasing levels of losses of coral populations within these environments. All right, so we've walked through this today. Oh yeah, so this is the slide which shows the increase in overall bleaching, coral bleaching, that's occurred since the 1970s in many different populations. And the trick about this is that corals are kind of like a keystone species within their environments, whereby their presence is necessary in order for all of these other species that use the coral in order to make their home, in order for them to survive. So if you have corals being lost, not only are you just losing the corals, but you're also losing all of these associated species that are dependent on the coral in order for survival. So loss of coral within these habitats means to large-scale losses in species diversity across the planet. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about all of these different responses and talked about multiple different ways in which species can potentially respond, either through adapting. We've seen lots of different examples of that occurring through things like phenological shifts. We see species moving in response to climatic shifts, and we see lots of examples that species might be pushing towards local extirpation as climate change occurs. So as we move forward, we'll talk about some of the interaction between these and some of the other major variables that define environments and define local biodiversity as we come back from the break after Thanksgiving. So we'll stop there and continue forward when you come back from your break.